5 years ago, the murder of George Floyd by a Minnesota police officer ignited a powerful global movement calling for recognition, justice, and change.
We are not deterred. We are recommitted. So do whatever you're going to do with the Department of Justice. We will not turn back. Justice for George Floyd. Say his name.
Over the weekend, marches and vigils sprung up across the U.S. to mark the date. Demonstrators took aim at White House-led cuts to DEI programs and police violence. Joining us this morning to reflect on where we stand, what still needs to change, is journalist and author of The Skin We're In, Desmond Cole. Good to have you back.
Good morning, Anne-Marie.
5 years after George Floyd's death, and I still remember that sound of him calling for his mother as he was dying. It was that cry that was a tipping point. When you look back, Desmond, over the last 5 years and this arc and trajectory, really globally that people have been on, but focusing specifically on North America, where are we at right now in terms of systemic racism and awareness and action?
I think we saw one of the biggest global movements, certainly in my lifetime, against police violence. And there was a lot of momentum to talk about anti-Black racism and policing, and we've slid back since that time. That's how I feel.
The latest stats show that police killings are on the rise, from 1,000 in 2019 to 1,200 in 2024. Why do you think meaningful reform is taking so long?
Because the state doesn't want meaningful reform, because after George Floyd was killed, the demonstrations, the sustained protest movement that lasted for months was so hard to ignore that I think politicians felt like they had to implement some kinds of changes, which they did. There were some changes to use of force, to chokeholds, to different kinds of policies in the United States. But the desire to continue to police all people, particularly the poor, particularly the homeless. George Floyd, we know, was somebody who was using a $20 counterfeit bill, right? The desire to police people like that in American society didn't change. And so we can't expect systemic change when America still has this desire to monitor, surveil, police people because they're poor, because they might use drugs, etc.
You know, police services will say, look, we broadened our recruitment. We've brought in more people of color. Has that made a difference? Has that made a change?
I've been reading reports since the 1980s in Canada saying that the problem with racist policing is that there aren't enough people of color on the force. The problem with sexist policing is that there aren't enough women on the force. We've been saying that in Canada since the 1980s. That's not the problem. The problem is who's being targeted, not who's doing the policing. The same groups of people, Black and Indigenous people in particular, are still being targeted. Poor people, people who use drugs, as I mentioned, despite who is wearing the uniform.
So where does the flip for that change come from then?
So in this country, you know, we had a report last year from the Ontario Human Rights Commission that said that Black people continue in Toronto to be discriminated against in terms of racial profiling, in terms of systemic bias. And what we need to see are approaches that don't prioritize force. Doug Ford just said that he wants to give more weapons, but he won't say who, to possibly transit cops, possibly different kinds of security forces, to expand the potential for use of force and death. We have to do the exact opposite. That's what's missing. What
are your concerns if we continue on this trajectory we're on right now in 2025?
Well, we know where this leads. We know, like, we talk about George Floyd so much in this country, but if I told your viewers the names Moses Irerhi or Regis Korchinski-Paquette or so many of the people who have died in this country, we don't talk about that at a national level the way that we talked about George Floyd getting killed in another country. So I also think it's incumbent upon us in the media to look. Like 6 people of Indigenous background were killed in the span of about 3 weeks last summer. That didn't become the national sensation that George Floyd being killed in America did. So we all have a responsibility to remember that this is not over because that movement happened. That movement was the reason for the changes that occurred. I would give credit to all of those people who demonstrated, who wrote to their legislatures, who got politically involved for the first time in their lives. That's why change started happening. It doesn't stop though. Like, we have to continue focusing on the bigger picture.
I want to talk about that change, Desmond, and something that people are following in headlines, both sides of the border, and that is those improved initiatives and awareness around EDI or DEI,
right.
And this backdraft that's come, right? This rollback and this cutting that's come, and whether it's loud by big companies or it's quiet, it's happening. Yeah, go ahead and say what you were going to say.
Just, you remember when Trump was accusing Haitians of eating dogs and cats? Things like that are an explicit invitation to police black people, saying that they are criminal, saying that their very presence in a community
crime.
Yeah, continues to be criminal, right? And so I think we all know where this goes. And I think the problem is confronting the idea that's been put into Canadian society, in our case, that if you don't police like this, people aren't going to be safe. That the only way we can have safe streets is if the police are out and allowed to use as much force as possible. The problem is they're using force against people who are out on the street homeless. They're using force against people who are using drugs. And the money that we are spending every year increasing our police budgets, that could be going towards housing. That could be going towards the drug rehab that Doug Ford and the federal conservative politicians say that they want, but don't implement when they get into power. We have to make choices. We have to actually make different priority choices about where we're going to spend money and what safety looks like. Because safety does not, to me, look like more people in uniforms with more weapons on our transit system, in our parks, in our public spaces.
To your point, and here in Canada, when you see more policing, when you see more uniforms on the street, I think the reaction is you feel less safe.
Well, it depends who you are, right? Some people have never had an issue with the police. Some people feel always that the police are there to protect them and to watch out for their safety, right? But we know in this country, given the history of this country, first with the colonization of Indigenous peoples, that the police have never been here to serve everyone equally. The RCMP was set up in large part to control Indigenous people whose land the Crown wanted for itself. This city that we live in has had a police force that has focused heavily on communities where black people live, where poor people live. It's not an accident. I think that's the other thing, Anne-Marie. We have to stop treating the outcomes of racist and harmful policing like they are an accident. We have to acknowledge that they are purposeful, and we have to shift our purpose to something else.
Desmond, it's always great to speak with you. Thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having me.
If you like that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.